Good morning and welcome to another stream covering the ACT Chess Association online events, which are currently happening while the ACT Chess Association clubs aren't meeting face to face, but some fantastically good news on that. The ACT restrictions on gatherings have been relaxed starting on the 29th of October. So Street Chess is going back face to face on the 30th at King O'Malley's, and a couple of the other clubs have already been contacted by their venues saying that they're most welcome back starting in the first week in November. So it looks like ACT Chess is going to be getting back to over the board. However, these events will still run possibly up until the end of the year, depending on, because not everything is getting restarted. Junior chess is unfortunately being affected at the moment because our venues are normally schools, and the schools are restricting who's allowed on site until at least the end of the term. My name is Sean Press. I run these events on behalf of the ACT Chess Association, and the event I am covering today is from last night's standard event. This is actually a long time control event, which means that each player starts with 40 minutes on the clock with a 15-second increment, and it's played with one round per night, weekly, every Thursday night, and it goes for 6 rounds. And we've already had one in this session. We had a few last year. We've already had one in this session, and this is number 2. And the game I'm choosing is between Mr. Troller YT and Matt Rad, who are two of the higher rated players in the event. And it turned into a very comprehensive win for Matt Rad, using a slightly, I wouldn't say unfashionable opening, but unambitious opening might be one way of putting it. But nonetheless, he then was able to take advantage of certain features in the position and finish with a nice sacrifice. So here we go. E4, D6, D4, Knight F6. So it's starting initially just to look like a modern or a perk, or Pierce, or depending on how you pronounce it. But the main line would be something like Knight C3, G6. Okay, but what Matt Rad is looking for is basically what's called the black line defense here, which is a way of getting into Philidor opening for black without allowing white to play some of the more dangerous lines. And in fact, white sidestepped this straight away with Knight D2, which isn't such a great choice here. Knight C3, Knight BD7 is the normal way of playing it. Knight F3 and E5. And the idea here is, yes, you've got a Philidor, but there are some lines for white which have been avoided, which are quite annoying. Ironically, well, not even ironically, but strangely, engines like to suggest that A4 is the right move here, in part because I think that just wants to deal with things like maybe the knight jumping to certain squares, but also I think there's a couple of trap lines in here where cutting off certain escape squares might be useful for white. Anyway, enough of that poor opening theory. Knight BD7, and the idea is that you're going to push E5 next move. You can play E5 straight away, but after takes and takes, and in this case, the reason why takes and takes is perfectly fine is because the knight's on D2 and not C3, so queen takes queen isn't a consideration. We bring out our pieces. Bishop C5 actually is not bad here. White has just got to make sure that knight G4, knight takes F2 doesn't hit the board. You can avoid that simply by something like bishop check, and after C6, just retreat back to D3. And knight G4 is just going to run into castles, and there's nothing there. So, knight Gf3, E5 as predicted, pawn to C3 to keep the centre intact, and black plays bishop E7, and probably the best move for white, and it's shown actually later in the game. Bishop just going straight to D3, castles, castles, C5, and you get this sort of position here. Weirdly enough, again, even though this is now a Philidor, the classifier on ChessBase argues that this is a Torre London or Collie system, which clearly it's not. Might be slightly confused about that. So, bishop E7, bishop C4 here, keeping an eye on F7. Turns out, as much as this looks aggressive, the bishop ended up being a bit misplaced here. H6, slightly weird move. I'll get into that in a second. Look, castles is fine. Just castles, castles, castles. Now, maybe Matt had an idea after H6. I mean, ostensibly it stops knight to G5 threatening f7, but castles deals with that quite happily. And given the next couple of moves, I'm not 100% sure whether Matt was just going, I'm not going to castle because I want to attack on the king side, or there was something at play. Not a mind reader here, so not quite sure what was happening. If Matt's watching this, maybe he can reply in the comment section at some point. Okay, so knight h4, and knight h4 is actually a mistake, but it does set some tricks, and maybe white chose this as the tricky move. So knight h4 is kind of inviting knight takes e4 here as a tactic, because after knight takes e4, bishop takes h4, and you've just won a pawn. And that's a fairly standard tactic that does turn up when the knights run off to the edge of the board like this. If your opponent plays knight h4 against you, and you've got enough pieces covering that square, always look at knight takes e4 as a way of trying to win a pawn. It doesn't in this case, though. And maybe this is what white was aiming for. Queen h5 is suddenly a strong move. You're attacking f7 with the bishop and the queen. And after queen here to defend that and keep the bishop protected, bishop takes f7, queen takes f7, queen takes h4, wins back the pawn. Material is equal, but white might be slightly worse in this position. It's kind of hard to say. But yeah, I mean, black has a pawn on e5, or 2 pawns in the center. Maybe that's the argument there. But after knight takes e4, white actually has a stronger move, and that is queen h5. And again, you're ganging up on this pawn here. And after castles, to get out of danger, you do run into a bit of a catastrophe after knight takes. Bishop takes h4 straight away to win back the piece. Seems sensible, but then bishop takes h6 is the reply, because if we play g takes h6, and I'm not saying you should play this, but just to show you what goes wrong here, queen to g6, and you can't take the queen because of the bishop has pinned the f7 pawn against the king. So if you took the queen, you'd be in check, so you're not allowed to. King has to go here, queen picks up another pawn, king goes back, and then you just castle queenside, and suddenly white is a lot better in this position, even though at the moment black is a piece ahead. There's a strong chance that they're going to get checkmated pretty shortly. So that's that one. Instead of bishop takes h4 back here, you can play the intermediate move, as they say. Knight b6, attack the bishop, and when the bishop retreats, then take on h4. Bishop takes h6 again, but now you can play d5. And the reason you can play d5 is because that knight on d7 is now moved to b6, and the queen is protecting the pawn. Bishop goes back, for example. Let's just do a bit of swapping, and it looks like, queen to f7 is going to be very strong here. Bishop f5 defends that square, but even after taking here, white is slightly better. Having said all that, black's choice of g6 wasn't that good. I mean, it does protect the f5 square, stops the knight jumping in. d5 was probably the right move here. After d takes, e takes, castles, let's keep grabbing some pawns, move that out of the way, and then after this, black is slightly better in this position. They've just got their development underway a little bit quicker, and also that knight sitting on h4 is actually doing nothing now. So after all that excitement, g6 was played instead. Queen b3 is a good move. We're hitting f7 again, and significantly, you can't castle in this position, because if you do, you just get hit by knight takes g6 again because of that pin on the f pawn. And I've in a couple of tournament games managed to do quite well when my opponents have missed this. So rook h7 was played. Now, if I claim that there was some grandmaster strategy behind Matt's play here, I might argue that h6 was played specifically to give the h7 square for the rook to move to, but even I am not going to make that claim because I don't really think that was the case. So rook went to h7, means black can't castle on the king side anymore. The knight retreated back from its excursion onto h4. And so we play a few more moves where both sides are keen to get their pieces out. Now note that the bishop on c4 has decided that it shouldn't have been on c4 and has moved back to d3. Queen to c7, so white castles. Of course, black can't castle kingside because of the rook sitting on h7. Knight to f8 was an interesting move. At first, I thought it might have been so that the knight could journey from f8, e6, f4, but it's more about letting the bishop on c8 out into the game. So exchange in the centre, knight goes to c4, and then the bishop goes to e6. And this was the idea behind moving the knight. Because of the pin, and you're threatening something annoying, just simply like b5 here, to win the knight, the queen retreated straight away, and then the knight came back from f8 to d7. This, by the way, is one of the small problems with the black line. If it was a universal, hey, I can get the position I want type opening, like the Collie and the London systems, it would be a much stronger opening. But one of the problems that black has, I think, is there's not enough room to put all their pieces on the board. And as you can see here, there was a lot of jumping around with the knight just so that the bishop could find a square. So that can be the risk in openings like this. Now, there is a small threat in this position involving the arrangement of the pieces, and that is knight takes e4. So, for example, if white plays a move like b4, which is not a bad move, by the way, the idea is that you can get knight takes e4, because if bishop takes e4, you just take the knight, which is now unprotected, hitting the rook on f1. And that's not a bad idea. White should actually take on e5 first, okay? Because then if there's a whole set of exchanges where black starts taking the white pieces on e5, eventually white will take that knight sitting on e4, and everything kind of falls out. Inequality. Knight g5 can be played here as well, offering to exchange a few things. And at first you might think that black is allowing white to ruin black's pawn structure by capturing a few times on g5. But in fact, after h takes g5, black, weirdly enough, gets the open h file, which is, funnily enough, what they got later in the game, and which is what they want. So the bishop instead went to e3. And now knight takes e4 doesn't quite work as well, because after knight takes here, as I said before, the knight retreats, and then we just start swapping a few things off. And white is slightly better. I'm going to say white is probably slightly better simply because the king is sitting in the middle of the board. And quite rightly, chess engines especially will evaluate positions strongly in favour of the side who doesn't leave their king sitting in the middle of the board, which I think is the correct evaluation, by the way. Should be getting your king to safety as soon as possible. Oh, moving back here. Knight g4 got played. Okay, rook over. So we play a few more moves. The knight took the bishop. The knight came back. Castles. Now, black doesn't mind these exchanges, by the way, because as I said before, one of the issues with this opening is a lack of space. Okay, so black is happy that one set of pieces has come off. Now, because black has castled queenside and white has castled kingside, we get what's basically known as a race here. While black is going to race their pawns up the kingside to try and expose the white king, white is going to race the pawns on the queen side with the same goal of trying to bring the king out to the open. And white kicked it off with b4, but it turns out that maybe, having said that exchanges are good for black, even one more exchange might actually help white. Bishop c4 here, and after takes and takes, white actually is a little bit better placed, mainly because I think white's pieces, especially the knight on c4, is better than its counterpart for the moment, sitting on d7. And by that I mean the knight on c4 can probably contribute to the attack on the queen side more than the knight on d7 can contribute to the attack on the king side for the moment. But b4, h5, no surprises here. Queen a4 ended up being a bit of a nothing move because after king b8, the queen just retreated. And I think losing tempo like that in positions like this can obviously count for a lot because you are actually trying to get there first. So g5. But g5 turned out to be, gave white an opportunity with knight d5. And the main reason why is because if you take the knight and we take back here, suddenly the bishop on d3 is hitting the rook, which is sitting on its own on h7. So g6 to g5 actually let that rook come under attack. And after rook back here, d takes, pawn takes, white is perfectly fine. The less pieces here, the weaker this attack is going to be for black. Cecil Purdy, the great Australian chess author and first world correspondence chess champion, suggested that when you're analysing positions, always look for jump moves. And what it means is pieces that can't normally jump over other pieces. Still imagine that they can. And the idea here is that you do spot a lot of discovered attacks. So, for example, in a position like this, if you notice that the bishop can jump over the pawn to take the rook, then a move like knight d5 actually becomes easier to spot. Instead, white played a4, continuing the race up the board. And now it turns out that because white's pieces are on the king side, more than black's pieces are on the queen side, moves like this do attack pieces. So the knight had to retreat and then h4. And suddenly white is well behind in the race. Having started out and ahead with b4, it's not so good now. And this is where it all really unraveled. Bishop c4 again to try and eliminate some pieces might be the best strategy, but g3 is coming now. h3 to try and stop that. We bring the king out in the open, we play knight f6. This position's good for black, but not winning for black. But nonetheless, black is happy to get here if white had played bishop to c4. Instead, the knight went back thinking it was going to try and protect g3, but after knight f6, b5, g3 could be played straight away, but white took on b5 first, and then played bishop c5, which is an excellent move for two reasons. One, it's protecting the h7 pawn from any tricks. It means that the pawn on b5 can't go to b6 with some ideas of opening up the position. And more importantly, it's, again, thinking about jump moves, it's covering the f2 pawn and the king on g1 so that that pawn on f2 can't move. So it's pinned, and g3 is the real strong threat here. c4 and g3 gets played. And after we took here, and we took here, black has an open file and is really close to winning in this position already. Now, just going to suggest another move here, but I'm going to say knight g4 was actually winning by even more with an except. So knight g4, rook e2 to cover the f2 square. Okay. Queen b6 to pile up on the f2 square. Knight b3 to allow the queen now to defend across the second rank. H takes, knight takes, bishop takes, rook takes, looks like you've just sacrificed a piece for nothing. And then queen e3 is the really strong response here. And this is actually winning by a lot more than what happened in the game. But the problem with this is just opening the H file, putting your rooks there is pretty straightforward. You can play that move by move without too much drama. This involved a lot of calculation if you were going to play this line. And more importantly, there's a bit of advice that when you calculate lines like this, you should always calculate one move further. And it takes a lot of discipline to get that right. Because white actually has queen here. Okay, that's fine. Black plays this move here. And then you've got to do more calculation about how the hell do I get out of danger in a position like this. And then the lines start to look like this. Now, in the end, black is perfectly fine and will win this position. But you've had to calculate basically 7 moves or close to 15 half moves to get to here. And the longer those calculations go for, the more likely it is there's going to be a mistake lying in wait. So if you've got the massively complicated winning line versus this looks pretty simple and straightforward winning line, just take the simple and straightforward winning line. Sure, you can do an Alekhine later and just pretend that you played the really complicated line, but just play the simple one. Knight takes, and now knight g4 is actually an excellent move because I think by now black has already spotted what's going to happen. If the queen on c7 can get to h2, it's going to be probably a checkmate at some point. The question is, how do we do it? So the rook went to e2 again to protect the square because queen b6, as we saw in the previous line, and then the rook goes to f1 here. Okay, so instead of moving the knight, which would have transposed into those other lines, rook over f1. Okay, now black Could try and get the queen over by playing something like bishop takes, because after bishop takes, queen h6, threatening mate on h7 is very strong, h2, sorry. But after knight f6, rook d h8 is actually the killer, because in fact what in this line black is going to do is just play queen h8 and the queen h1 and sack the queen. And that looks pretty spectacular. It's always nice to end a game by sacrificing your queen. So this is completely winning for black. Instead, black threw the rook across first. No dramas there. We've still got the same ideas going. And indeed, if knight f3 was played now, bishop takes, queen h6 just leads to the same variation that we looked at previously. So the knight went to b3 instead. Okay. And black now has a number of paths to victory. This is, by the way, there's a forced mate in this position. Doesn't matter. Already, white can't survive here. Queen d8 was one way of doing it, with the idea again of just either throwing queen across to h4 or finishing the game off in the way that we will see very shortly. Bishop went to d7 with the same idea, which is to clear the third rank so that the queen can get to h6. Knight took here, at which point black played the double rook sacrifice that I think they've been planning for a few moves now. Okay, it looks pretty threatening that knight takes d7 is on the board and forking king and queen, but black has all the checks and that's all he needs. Rook check, knight takes is forced. Rook sack, king takes is forced, and queen h6. And this was what white had calculated a few moves earlier. And of course, the only move now is to play king here, and then queen h2 was made. And it was all over. And it was a nice win for Matt Rad, a nice sacrificial win. I will note that there were a few really well-played games last night that I could have featured. I did choose this one simply because there was the double rook sack, and it's always good to look at double rook sacrifices or queen sacrifices. The game's a little bit more exciting, but it is fair to say that choosing games like this do penalise people who play nice, sensible, grinding chess. It might not be the most exciting chess, but it can be the most effective chess. But in this case, Matt Rad took advantage of opponents' few poor choices, but I think in the end, Matt Rad wasn't playing so much hoping his opponent would make a mistake. He was playing for a certain position, and it was just helped by the fact that the opponent misdefended at the crucial moments as well. So that was from last night's ACTCA standard event, played with a time limit of 40 minutes plus 15 seconds per move. My name is Sean Press. I organise these events on behalf of the ACT Chess Association and then do these broadcasts normally the day after and around about 10 o'clock in the morning Canberra time. So you can either tune in now or I upload them to YouTube also when I finish, so you can see them on replay if you need to. So thanks for tuning in, and I'll probably be online maybe on this coming Sunday covering the Street Chess event. But until then, I'll be seeing you later.